Welcome everybody back to our evening event after the United Nations Science Summit. Thank you for joining us today. And this evening we have an incredible lineup for you. We have some first time in history events. So I'm going to start here with my good friend, Vint Cerf. And it's so wonderful to have you here and to join me here for this event and to see you after all these years. It's been a while. And even though we're in contact online regularly, it's been a long time since I've seen you. So the years do go on. And I guess first of all, I was very touched by the time frame when you discovered that you were ill with COVID. And I'm just wondering if you could tell me how that affected you, what you thought about, and how it's affected what you've done since.
So my wife and I, in 2020, were traveling quite a bit. We were in England, in London, 3 times in January, February, and March. And as we returned from our March visit, we brought COVID with us. And this was at a time when COVID was just starting to be recognized as a serious problem. It wasn't clear exactly how it was being propagated. It was very difficult for us to even get a test to find out whether we had COVID, but we had the symptoms, dry cough and other things. So fortunately, our symptoms were not so severe that we had to be hospitalized or anything like that, but we were exhausted and we were really just pooped for almost a month. And so it didn't know how long this was going to persist. Our younger son, bless his heart, flew from Los Angeles to us in Northern Virginia and did the shopping and the cooking for several weeks. And then we slowly came out of it. I thought it took almost 2 years to get back to my normal energy level. Fortunately, or unfortunately, COVID was spreading, and so I wasn't traveling at all, and so it didn't require the same energy level that I would normally have to have in order to do all the international travel. So I worried a lot about whether there were going to be long-term side effects. We're on the older side of the ledger these days, and there were a lot of stories of people who contracted the disease and then had a lot of bad side effects and eventually got hospitalized. Some people had long COVID. So we worried about how the pandemic was going to pan out. So many people were either dying or in severe conditions. But the only thing that it did was to demonstrate that you didn't have to travel in order to do your work. And in my case, I've been traveling a lot for the last, years of my career, 50 years. And so the notion of doing something remotely and interacting over the net was perfectly normal. And it just became the norm for quite a long time. Now we have people who have learned that you can work from almost anywhere, and getting them back into the office is turning out to be harder than I expected. And with the recent uptick in COVID and the increased communicability of the most recent variants, I think we're not out of the woods yet. I mean, we're done with COVID, but COVID isn't done with us. But it hasn't really affected me much, except that you notice that people are a little more careful. But we're all tired of wearing masks, and so you don't see very much masking going on.
So before we get into all of the other things that everybody knows about you, one of the things that I discovered about you is how much you know about biology and microbiology, and you really went deep into some research into that. And I'm just wondering, what is it that you've learned, and where do you see the direction going in terms of health in the world?
Well, first of all, the reason I got interested in microbiology was I got very curious about cancer, and it wasn't because I had cancer or that anyone of my acquaintance had it. It's just that when I realized that cancer is cell proliferation without end, And so I wondered, well, aren't cells supposed to just reproduce for some number of replications and then commit suicide? It's cell apoptosis. And so I asked one of my biologist friends where I could learn more. And this is Bruce Alberts, who used to be the head of the National Academy of Sciences. No, I think it was science, not medicine. So Bruce said, oh, well, we have a book on the microchemistry of the cell. It's only 1,700 pages long, and it's large format. So I said, okay, well, I'll get the latest edition. And he said, well, you better get the other 6 also. I said, well, why is that, Bruce? And he said, well, in order to keep it from getting any bigger, every year when we issue a new edition with new material, we remove some of the older material. So if you want to read the older material, you have to get the earlier editions. So I have a stack of these microchemistry books. And I read about how cells proliferate and how they manage to avoid or evade their normal lifetimes. So I don't know how much you want me to go into this, but I got so fascinated by how cells work. And my early, naive view of cells was, well, you have a cell membrane, and there's a nucleus, and then there's little chemical things that bang into each other inside the cell, and stuff happens every once in a while. Nothing could be more wrong. Turns out cells have enormous amounts of structure. They're like downtown Manhattan in terms of the structure and the things that go on. And the more I learned about it, the more excited I got about how intracellular communication works. There are small molecules that are used and are moved around inside the cell by other small molecules that transport these molecules and small proteins from one part of the cell to another. And and they're tagged with little indicators about where they're supposed to go. It's like packet switching inside the cell. So, I mean, I found this completely fascinating. And I imagine that if I knew, what little I do know about microbiology, I might very well have wanted to go into that. But you have to remember that we know stuff today because of our ability to measure an image, and to say nothing of sequencing DNA and understanding how to interpret the RNA as a sequence of amino acids that turn into proteins. We didn't know most of that, or we knew what the DNA was, but we didn't have the ability to sequence it. And in order to even ask the question, what do these various proteins do? What function do they have in the body? But today it might be a different question, particularly now that we're starting to learn how the proteins fold up, and their structure, of course, determines what they're capable of interacting with. One of the sister organizations of Google is called DeepMind, and they did a really interesting machine learning experiment with other people. They figured out how to train a machine learning system to figure out how proteins fold up. And once you know that, then given a sequence of amino acids, you can say what shape it will assume. And once you know the shape, you have some idea of where and how it might interact with other parts of the body. So I'm imagining in 2023, the tools that are available would make for some very, very interesting discoveries, especially with small molecules that might be used to interfere with some harmful process that has taken hold in a cell to inhibit it from, for example, proliferating forever. But you said I knew a lot. I don't know very much. I know just a teeny bit.
It's pretty clear that he
I have
knows a lot.
I have a little bit of the vocabulary, which makes you sound very smart for about 5 minutes. And then when a real biologist comes and asks you a question, you look like an idiot. So I'm very careful not to talk to very many biologists.
So speaking about machine learning and AI, you, more than anybody in the world, have watched this progress. I'd like to know what has surprised you about AI and machine learning, and what do you foresee as its good points, and what do you foresee as the dangers?
So I'm really glad that you used the term machine learning and not large language models, which is the most recent manifestation of insanity. So on the machine learning side, what is fascinating is that the ideas were hatched in the 1960s with something called a perceptron, which is a one-layer deep neural network, basically just one layer. And the guys that developed it knew that it didn't do very much. And Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert at MIT wrote a book called Perceptrons, and they trashed the whole idea because it couldn't even tell, for example, whether a graph was connected or not. And so it's a pretty modest kind of goal to have. And so for about a dozen years, the research community didn't invest very much in neural networks because they were known to be weak. Well, of course, it turns out to be wrong. If you could build multi-layer networks, 100 layers deep or 500 layers deep, they can do some really amazing stuff. And the reason they can is that imagine the state space of a 500-layer neural network. It's huge, which means the amount of information that you could represent in that complex state space is huge, which is exactly what has happened with large language models. But to come back to machine learning, we know that there are very clever ways of using machine learning models to do very practical things. So let me just give you one or two examples. One of the things that we do at Google is build data centers. And they have a lot of computers in them, and they use up a lot of electricity, and they generate a lot of heat. And you have to get rid of some of the heat, because otherwise the computers melt themselves. And they didn't accept my idea, which was to put a pizza oven on the top of the racks so that we could go into a secondary line of business. They said the cheese drips down into the computers and makes a mess, so they didn't do that. So every week we have some poor soul looking at how much energy has been used to cool the data center. What valving and what pumping rates and all this other stuff. And then they would try to set the parameters to minimize the cost of doing the cooling. So somebody said, why don't we train a machine learning model to figure out how to minimize the cost? The objective function is minimize cost of cooling. So they trained the system over several weeks. And when they ran it to control the valving and pumping, they saved 40% of the power required to cool the data center. That was a significant result. So, of course, we ran off to do that in all the other data centers. That's one example of practicality. The folding of proteins that DeepMind did, they folded 200 million proteins, which could be produced by the DNA of the human body. And again, creating a kind of dictionary of small molecules that might turn out to be useful in healthcare and defense against disease and things like that. Self-driving cars, which are controversial, but you can think of making a car recognize its environment sufficiently to drive is rather an amazing accomplishment. So there's a long list of things that you can do. Oh, I left out one of the most important and common ones: speech recognition, speech understanding, and speech generation. And the speech generation side has two aspects to it. One is you can just talk to your computer and it talks back, which is good for people who are not literate or for people who can't type or who are blind. So that's a big benefit, very pragmatic, practical. The other thing is that we can use the same mechanisms to translate from one language to another. And that used to be a clumsy thing that didn't work very well. There was a significant jump in the utility and accuracy of translation. So machine learning is a very broad field. Oh, there's another example. We've done some work with a company that's trying to build a fusion reactor. And to do that, of course, you will remember you need a plasma that is stable. But the plasmas become unstable under certain conditions. If you could detect the instability forming fast enough, you could respond to that and try to maintain the plasma. So machine learning models have been built that have learned how to do that. and they have to control things faster than a human being could. So there are all kinds of useful things. And then there are the large language models. They're the ones that are so-called generative AI, and that's the big thing these days. It's appealing because it generates stuff that you sort of are surprised that it can do. You know, if you ask it to write a poem about something in the style of Shakespeare, it will do that. But I asked it to do something just as a test. I said, write an obituary for Vint Cerf. And it's not because I think I'm going to die soon. I hope not. But I knew that the obituary format was probably ingested into the large language model because it's pulling stuff from the World Wide Web, and the web has lots of obituaries in it. And I also knew that it had probably gotten some information about me. I know that I have a Wikipedia page and things like that. So it generated an obituary for me. We're sorry to report to you, Dr. Cerf passed away, and it picked a date. That was a little unsettling. And then it had career information and family information. But in the career information, it gave me credit for stuff I didn't do, and it gave other people credit for stuff I did. And when we got down to the family section, it made up family members I don't have. At least I don't think so. Not that I know of. So, and I remember I was scratching my head saying, well, how could it do that? There was a lot of factual information there. How did it conflate the information and produce counterfactual stuff? And then it dawned on me that the training mechanisms don't have very good context. So if your bio and my bio were on the same web page, it could easily pluck words, which they call tokens or phrases, from our bios and notice that they were not very far apart, so they have a probability of occurring within some distance of each other. So when it's in generative mode, it could easily pluck bits and pieces out of these two theoretically distinct pieces of information and conflate them. So it turns out there's a formal term for this that many of you have heard. It's called hallucination. And the practitioners of large language models use that word to describe a model that's responding to a prompt by generating hallucinations. So now I think I should do a video, and since we're doing one right now, I wanted to do this one in German with English captions and pretending to be Sigmund Freud. So, what we have now is the artificial id and the artificial ego. What we do not yet have is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id and the artificial ego. And then we'll go on from there. And in the end, I would hold up a cigar and say, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But people need to know that these things can conflate factual information into counterfactual stuff. So we have to learn not so much how to suppress that, which is the current reaction, but rather how to increase the context that the large language model has available to it to segregate factual information and to not accidentally generate conflated mistakes. So we still have a ways to go before we can make that happen.
Do you think that there's going to be a crossover into control of cyber-physical devices and systems?
We're already there. And this might give some people some pause. If you build APIs that will accept spoken or written language as a way of interacting and causing something to happen, think about a financial transaction, think about writing a piece of code, thinking about doing a piece of mathematics. They're building APIs that allow the large language model to call for help and assistance from something which either might simply provide it with the answer to a mathematical expression, or it might allow it to do a transaction like scheduling an airline flight or a hotel reservation or a restaurant reservation. The question is, how much should we trust the large language model that's generating the commands to these ancillary systems? And I think the jury, at least in my view, is still out on how to manage the ability to control things to make sure that they're not controlled inappropriately. or ineffectively.
When I was on the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, which you encouraged me to do many, many years ago, and I worked on the Health Systems Group, we got into some discussions about medical devices and the need to know where a person was and to know the identity of their device and to know that the devices were not reporting improperly. And I was an advocate of accurate time stamping.
Yes.
And I was also an advocate of not allowing people to have a lot of aliases and to hide behind the perception of privacy versus security. So in that regard, there's been a lot of discussion in Europe about the right to be forgotten, which I think, well, I'm asking you the question, but we have this issue of the right to be forgotten, and in my mind, this gets into some of these issues that we went through about medical devices, because you don't want your medical device to be forgotten, and you want to know that your pacemaker or your device that is managing your glucose levels is reporting properly so that your devices do not pump in a lot of extra insulin at the wrong time. And there are some issues with that, including fast timing and so forth. So I'm wondering what you think about all of that.
This sounds like one of those final exams that says, describe the universe in 25 words or less. Give 3 examples. So I'll try to at least capture some of this. First of all, device identification, the ability to validate the identity of a device is very important. The device needs to know the identity in a strongly verifiable way of anything that's trying to control it or anything that is supposed to report data to. So you want confidence that the interactions that an IoT device or a medical device is interacting with only authorized parties, so that's important. The notion of anonymity in general, I think, is difficult to deal with, even though we know that it is attractive, for example, for whistleblowing and things like that. Even in that scenario, often the party to whom the whistle is blown needs to know the validity of the party making the assertions, even though that person who's receiving the whistleblow may be obligated to protect the privacy of the reporting individual, but may have to know it in order to gain credibility of the report. So the reason that I think anonymity has to be thought of very carefully is that you can't hold parties accountable if you can't identify them. So at some point we have to have the ability to penetrate the veil of pseudonymity under the right conditions and circumstances, protecting the rights that people are supposed to have, just like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we have to have the ability to exercise that penetration. It's a little bit like license plates. You look at a license plate and it looks like random numbers and letters, but some people have the authority to pierce the veil of pseudonymity and ask who owns the car. That may not tell them who was driving the car, but at least it's the beginning of holding parties accountable. So I think that we are entering a period where accountability is turning out to be really important. And we're seeing that on an international scale, where people are worried about cybercrime. What is it? How do we detect it? How do we hold parties accountable? How do we have international agreements to extradite people appropriately? All that's being debated right now in the UN setting. So I'm convinced that we're entering a period where accountability and agency are important. So on the agency side, people should have the ability to strongly authenticate themselves or to encrypt their communications. So people who are asking for backdoor into the cryptography are really asking for trouble, because as soon as there's a backdoor, somebody will find it or it'll leak, and then nobody has any security at all. So I think that's important. Incidentally, strong authentication of your own identity is your friend in many instances. You don't want someone else being able to claim they're you and then take actions that you didn't authorize, like emptying your bank account or buying tickets on an airplane. So strong authentication, even if it's a pain in the neck, is your friend here to avoid being impersonated. So there are lots of ramifications of the questions that you're raising. I think we are now at a point where the internet has penetrated enough and that everybody's running around with a mobile, which we're too dependent on, by the way. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get nervous if my mobile doesn't work. There are cascade failures. Like, I can't get logged into this until I can get a passcode on my mobile, which I can reflect back to say, yes, I'm the same person you think I am, two-factor authentication. If the mobile doesn't work, or if you're in a place where you're not allowed to use a mobile, then you have a problem. So I'm very worried. I wish that we had more flexibility for devices other than the mobile, like a pad or a laptop or some other IoT device, which could serve as the second factor in authentication, not just that one device. So we're, as wonderful as it is, when it doesn't work, it's really troublesome.
Which brings me to my next question of what about embedded devices for identification?
Ooh. Well, they do that with dogs and cats and things like that. I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of sticking a chip. Some people are saying, well, it's a great way to keep track of my kid. And I sort of hear that, but it just feels a bit over the top surveillance environment. On the other hand, let's suppose that you had a relative who had a serious case of Alzheimer's. Then you'd kind of want to be able to find them if they wander off somewhere. So, but you don't necessarily have to have an embedded chip to do that. I mean, it could be a mobile, it could be something else that has a GPS capability. So I think it's awfully tempting, but I think very dangerous to think about embedding chips in people. Although, having said that, there may be other reasons for embedding chips in people that are very beneficial. My wife has 2 cochlear implants. For all practical purposes, those are chips embedded in her auditory nerve. And she has an external speech processor. And the same argument might be made, as you suggest, for pacemakers and for insulin injection and monitoring. It does, though, mean that you want to make sure that whatever software is driving those things has been checked, very, very thoroughly. And you don't want them to be controllable by anything other than something that the device itself can verify is authorized.
I guess I have to ask, how is your dog? How's her dog? You said your wife loves dogs, little dogs. And you know that I lost my little dog, Pepper, not too long ago. And I thank you for the nice little message. It really did break my heart. But I'm just wondering, does she still have her dog? And
no, our little beagle lived for about 13 years. She's a regulation 13.5-inch beagle. She's gone to her just reward. We have 2 low-maintenance dogs now. They were made in Australia. They're little kind of lattice-work dogs, and they sit at the front door. And we have 2 little doggy cookies waiting, in front of them. But they're very low maintenance, and they just keep us happy. But we travel too much now, and it's not fair to the dog to put them into the kennel so frequently. But we did. This little beagle was really a sweet dog. Not very smart, and never knew when to stop eating, but a very sweet dog anyway.
what was its name?
Oh, this was Sally.
Sally. Okay.
And this is, not the first name you think of for a dog, but it turned out that Sigrid, my wife, when she was in grade school, didn't like her name. It's Swedish. And for some reason, at that point in her life, she decided she wanted a more conventional name. So she started signing her papers in her grade school, Sally. Of course, the teacher didn't know who the hell Sally was. And eventually this got all sorted out. But our 2 sons, when they heard this story, decided that the dog should be called Sally.
Oh, that's great. So you've changed the world. You've changed the world forever. Certainly, especially as you brought up during COVID, everybody moved to the internet, and it kept the world going. People were able to communicate. People started communicating that couldn't communicate before. I have another question to follow that up with, but my first question is, at what point did you realize that your plans for an internet were going to really have a big effect on the world?
Well, I think the first thing that everybody needs to accept is it's not me alone. It's not Bob Kahn and me alone. It's millions of people who committed themselves to making the internet happen and run. I mean, the internet doesn't run itself. I wish it did. But in fact, there's lots and lots of people that defended against attack, that maintain the software. They have to upgrade things. They have to fix bugs. And so this is a huge enterprise. Now, to answer your question, this started out as a research experiment and it's with deep roots back in the late 60s with the Defense Department. We started the actual design work for what is now internet in 1973, linking 3 different kinds of nets together. But it was entirely a research activity. We thought it had utility for military command and control. We knew we had to do voice, video, and data. It had to work in mobile operation and ships at sea and aircraft, in addition to fixed installations. So all of those desirable characteristics had to be fed into the protocols. I didn't fully appreciate how big this could be until 1988, which from my point of view is 15 years into the program. And the reason that I finally realized this was going to be a big deal is that there was an exhibition called Interop, which allowed people who built hardware and software for internet to display that all their stuff interworked. That was important. So interoperability was a key element of the design. And multiple parties could build software and hardware, and if they hooked up to an Ethernet or other network link, they could communicate with each other. So the Interop exhibition was to show off what worked. And I walked in 1988 in Moscone Center in San Francisco. 50,000 people were coming to the show. And Eric Benamou, who at the time was the CEO of 3Com, a company that made Ethernets for sale, and I were walking in, and the first thing I see is a 2-story display from Cisco Systems, which is only a 4-year-old company. And they're already building these 2-story displays that are big enough for people to get into and equipment to be shown off. And I turned to Eric and I said, Eric, how much did these displays cost? And he said, in 1988 dollars, about $250,000. And then he said, that doesn't count the cost of the people that are maintaining and operating these things for the customers. And my jaw is dropping at this point, and I'm trying to figure out, wow, somebody thinks they're going to make money out of the internet. And then I wondered, how is it ever going to get into the hands of the general public? Because in those years, all the way up until 1992, it was not legal to carry commercial traffic on the government-sponsored internet. So I'm sitting there in 1988 thinking, how do I break that rule? And I had done some work for MCI. It was an MCI mail commercial email system, not the first one by any stretch. The earliest emails come in 1971 with Ray Tomlinson at Bolt, Beranek and Newman. Of course, it takes over the network by storm. So I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I could get permission to connect the MCI mail system to the internet as an experiment. But that would break the appropriate use policy that says no commercial traffic is allowed to go on the government-sponsored backbone, of which there were 4. There was the ARPANET, there was the NSFNet backbone, plus its 13 other networks, regional networks, the Department of Energy Sciences Net, and the NASA Science Internet. So all 4 of those are government-sponsored, paid for by the government. And so I come along saying, can I connect MCI mail to the internet? And the Federal Networking Council in 1988 said, oh, well, that's an interesting question. Why don't you try it, just for a year? So we managed to get a gateway built in 1989. We're running it. We announced that MCI mail can reach everybody on the internet. All the other commercial email providers Telemail and OnTime and CompuServe and others say, well, wait a minute, these people can't have this special privilege. We want to connect up to the internet too. And the Federal Networking Council allowed them to do it. Then they discovered that by virtue of having been connected to the internet, all of their customers could communicate with all the customers of their competitors because they could go through the internet. And so the Federal Networking Council permitted this continuing use of commercial traffic flowing into and out of the government-sponsored backbones until 1992, when one of the House members, Senator Boucher, or no, Congressman Boucher, Bill Boucher, managed to put an amendment into the National Defense Authorization Act that made it legal under the law for commercial traffic to flow on the government-sponsored backbones. And guess who helped pass that along? Al Gore, who had been elected vice president. And so he was very helpful in sort of paving the way for that piece of legislation. So by 1992, we now have legal permission for commercialization. And some of you will remember that in December of 1991, Tim Berners-Lee releases the World Wide Web, which almost nobody noticed. It was a text-based browser. But two guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, take one look at this browser idea and this World Wide Web idea, and they say, well, what about a graphical user interface? And they developed the Mosaic browser, which makes the internet look like a magazine with formatted text and imagery and eventually streaming audio and video. And they release it for free, just like Tim Berners-Lee released HTTP and HTML for free. And as soon as, oh dear, I'm going to draw a blank here. The then head of Silicon Graphics, whose name has just gone out of my head, which is embarrassing, saw the Mosaic browser and said, this is a big deal. And he takes the guys from NCSA, brings them back to the West Coast, and they start Netscape Communications. And they make a browser called Netscape Navigator. And this took the world by storm. And by 1995, the company had gone public, and the stock went through the roof. And all the venture capital people in the Silicon Valley started throwing money at anything that looks like it might be related to the internet. And this goes on until April of 2001. And all those companies that got all that capital, most of them died because the CEOs didn't know the difference between revenue and capital. Revenue is supposed to keep going. Capital is finite. And so the Silicon Valley is littered with the dead bodies of startups that didn't survive. But some of them did. How about Amazon, 1994? How about Google, 1998? How about Yahoo, 1994? Well, not so. That has not done quite so well. But there were a number of companies that survived and thrived after the dot boom was over. So for me, that period of time was sort of ridiculous hype, followed by solid continued growth and internationalization. I know that was a really long answer.
That's great. I guess that leads to the next question, which is obviously the internet enabled a gigantic hardware industry. And what are your thoughts on how that played out?
I'm sorry, the gigantic...
The hardware industry.
Oh, the hardware.
That was enabled by the internet.
Yeah, well, actually two things happened. Cisco Systems, of course, starts in 1984. Sun Microsystems starts about the same time, and they're building workstations, and they're running the internet protocols with Sun OS, which was a variant, I guess, of Unix. Unix, by the way, played a really big role in the spread of internet, and so did Ethernet. The universities were buying Ethernets, and they were buying Unix workstations, which came with TCP/IP from Berkeley. And that led to rapid proliferation in the university community and created a market. So there was a lot of market for hardware. Juniper came along as another one, and Proteon was another one. And so making hardware that ran internet software was really a big deal. And then, of course, workstations come along, and then laptops come along in the early 1980s. But then an interesting thing happened. The computers that were running the internet protocols got so powerful that it was possible to write software instead of hardware to do a lot of the processing. And so this idea of software-defined networks came along. OpenFlow came out of Stanford University, for example, which gave enormous flexibility to the processing of each packet. And their special hardware was built with pipeline processing in order to allow large numbers of packets to be processed according to a software specification written in the P4 language. So software-defined networking has become another major element, but hardware for special purpose processing has really made the network run at the speeds it does now. The optical fiber network backbones currently run at 400 gigabits per second per channel. And that may be 800 gigabits a second in the next year or so. And that's per channel on the optical fiber. You have multiple channels at different wavelengths. So imagine that you have packets arriving at 800 gigabits a second. You got to use hardware in order to process that. So it's a little bit like the toll roads, where when you come to a toll booth, they process the cars in parallel by spreading it out across 32 different toll booths, and then they reconvene at the next end. So some of these systems are using hardware to do that.
So Google has one of the most secure browsers, perhaps the most secure browser in the world. How much do you think that what effect do you think that had on Google's success, the security issue?
Well, we certainly pay a lot of attention to security, but I believe a lot of the other people who make internet-based gear are equally aware of the importance of security. We go way out of our way. In 2010, our network was attacked. We believe that the attack came from China, and they were able to get access to unencrypted information. And our response to this was to immediately introduce end-to-end encryption of any transfer through the network and encryption of all the data that's at rest in the data centers. So that if somebody were able to break into the data center, they'd still have to break the crypto to make use of it. So we introduced what everybody today would call HTTPS, which opens up a TLS TCP channel to whatever the destination is and encrypts all the traffic going back and forth. We've also introduced another protocol that's called QUIC, Q-U-I-C, which combines the TCP and TLS functions as a single function. It does a lot of other useful things like running parallel channels within a QUIC channel for independent flow control of multiple channels, fully encrypted. So, and also we've just recently introduced the use of the post-quantum crypto algorithms, because now that it's been anticipated that the quantum machines will run Shor's algorithm and break RSA and all the other algorithms that are dependent on the difficulty of factoring the products of large primes, which is how RSA works, we now have post-quantum algorithms that use lattice mathematics for the work factor. And we're introducing that into our systems now because we know that some people are harvesting encrypted stuff in the hope that 10 years or 20 years from now, when the quantum computers can run Shor's algorithm, they can break the data that might still be useful. So we're trying to get ahead of the game.
So we know that China has put up a very advanced computer in space that is able to break some quantum encryption and is also operating in a way that is undetectable, supposedly.
Oh, no. Okay,
No?
so you're conflating things,
Okay.
so let me try to clarify. They have not put a quantum computer in space. That's not correct. Nobody has a useful quantum computer yet. We're working on it, and others are too. What they have done is to do what's called quantum key distribution. And what that amounts to, basically, is generating a key sequence and transmitting it as entangled photons. to two different receivers. So when you generate a pair of entangled photons that carry one bit of information, and they're received by the two different parties, they are sent as very low energy photons. And if somebody tries to intercept that signal in order to capture it, they destroy the quantum entanglement in the process, or the photons are too weak to even be detected. So we can tell if someone has interfered with the transmission of an entangled photon, because the receivers on both ends have to know which measurement to make to figure out whether it was spin up or spin down, for example. And they do this at random. This is trying to not be get too deep into this, but at the end, the only bits that you care about are the ones that both receiving parties measured the same way. And so they make a bunch of measurements. Some of them are random. Some of them don't work because the entangled particle was interfered with. But after they have made all their measurements, then they can tell each other which measurement they made. That does not reveal to the other party what the value was that was measured, because if they'd interfered with it by trying to measure it, they would have destroyed the entanglement, so that they would have gotten useless data. So if we actually got something useful, we can use ordinary conventional means to say, this was the measurement that I took. So you can look, each of the two parties can look at what measurements they made, what values they got, and they only take the values that were measured the same way. And we've got to the point now where these kinds of systems can generate successfully megabits per second of a key stream. So that's what's actually going on, and the Chinese have done that, and I think others have as well. So it's becoming a viable technique for doing key distribution.
So do you really think that you'll be able to build the interplanetary internet? And if so, what do you think is really going to be required to do this soon?
Well, I think it's almost inevitable at this point, assuming, of course, that there is serious intent to do exploration in space and exploitation and commercialization and the like. And the reason I think this is that no one country and no one company will really be able to put forward the expense needed to get enough of this stuff up there to be useful. So if you're trying to provide commercial operations of some kind or another, you really would like all the parties who are willing to work on comms for whatever reason. Some of them to communicate with research spacecraft, some of them are trying to offer commercial service. I think that we will see a drive towards collaboration and cooperation for the same reason that happened on the internet. And given that there will be less proliferation in the near term than even in the internet case, it's a lot easier to pull cable under the ocean than it is to send spacecraft in orbit, get them landed successfully, get them power supplies that live through the lunar night and it's to say nothing of Mars. So there is going to have to be a lot of collaborative work here if this is going to work at all. So I hope that people will see that as a pragmatic.
So now more than half of the people in the world have the internet, maybe closer to
Pretty close to 2/3 now.
Close to 2/3 of the internet.
But not all of them are the same quality. I mean,
Right.
So it's not true that everybody has the same internet access, and not everybody has the same equipment to use it, or the capacity to use it, or the training to use it. So there's still a lot of disparity.
So I've noticed that native tribes, even tribes in the United States, are still without the internet. They've been completely left out, and there's a lot of people that have a little bit of internet, but it's not working very well, and I was rather shocked at the figures that I found. One of the things that I noticed is that there's been some funding that has been given for native tribes, but when you look into the details, it was only 3 tribes, 3 or 4 tribes, and it only handled 40 households or something. So then you see all this money coming from Broadband America and Broadband USA, but I'm wondering, why isn't any of that funding going to Native tribes or to help Native tribes get the internet?
Well, I don't know all the details of the allocation of the $42 billion for the broadband initiative. The NTIA is responsible for the allocation, and there's a formula for going to the various states. The states themselves will make decisions about where to spend the funds that are made available to them. And so at the state level, there needs to be a decision to support tribal communication. There's extra money. It was included in the $42 billion specifically to go to the tribes. Your point is that it probably isn't sufficient, but it's at least some of that was especially earmarked. What really needs to happen is that we need to drive the cost of access to the internet down. The Starlink system, which I've used from time to time, actually worked pretty well. I was out on the water in the Puget Sound area in mid-June and used the Starlink system very successfully, including even a video conference, which surprised me. So in theory, that system could reach all of the Native American territories in the U.S. The question is, how much does it cost and whether or not that's affordable? And that's a big issue. But one way to deal with that is not to go build infrastructure, but to provide some subsidy. Now, even that isn't perfect because the subsidy would have to continue, and eventually the money runs out. What you really want to do is make an investment that allows our Native Americans in the tribal zones especially to create businesses that are, grows the economy on a per capita basis. So that's the real important thing, is investing in those territories, using remote communications so they can monetize their skills.
And educate themselves.
Oh, plainly, yeah.
Over the internet. Well, I have just one more question, and that is, how do you see dealing with the issue that was brought up today among some of our pioneer speakers, our new pioneer speakers, the issue of space debris? What are your thoughts on space debris?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of it. And second, it's hard to track some of the smaller components. And so figuring out how to detect it and how to, somehow capture it is pretty important, especially as we increase the population of orbiting assets so dramatically. I mean, all by itself, the SpaceX Starlink team is putting tens of thousands of satellites in orbit. At least that's the plan. And we know that some of those will eventually fall out of orbit or might collide, in which case, or to make matters worse, some countries have decided to demonstrate that they have anti-satellite capability by blowing up one of their own satellites. It's a good thing they didn't blow up one of ours, because that would probably be an incident of the first order. But blowing up their own satellite creates more debris. So 2 things occur to me. One of them is to start thinking about how to deal with the normal course of satellite demise. Up until now, a lot of them have been put into parking orbits rather than getting them to deorbit and burn up in the atmosphere. So I would rather see some more attention paid to removal of these things without production of debris. However, with the number of satellites up there, it's possible that they'll bump into each other and cause, more incidents to happen. I'm not an expert, but I do wish there was some way to invent a space vacuum cleaner that would, find this debris and suck it all up. I think it's not that easy when things are moving at 17,000 miles an hour.
So if you had to write your own obituary, so to speak, what would you want it to say? What would you want to be remembered for in the world? And let's say 500, maybe 1,000 years from now.
Oh my.
What would you want people to know about you and to read about you?
The bad thing is that most of the people we remember for 1,000 years are the people that did something really bad. So I don't know whether an aspiration to want to be known 1,000 years from now might be an aspiration to be known for having done something really bad. Well, I hope people might remember that there was a time when there wasn't an internet, and 1,000 years from now there'll be something else, and it might not be called internet, but it will be, I hope, a global communication system that all the members of the population use. So I'd like to be remembered as a pioneer for that, because I hope that it would be useful for everybody, or could be made useful for everyone on the planet. And that's still my aspiration. We're not done yet.
Ask about the Amazon.
Oh,
Oh, yes, we're going to have a feed from the Amazon rainforest.
okay.
This will be the first time in the world that they've ever had access to the internet and have ever done anything like this. So they're going to be coming in live from the Amazon rainforest on Starlink dishes that were
Wow.
hiked in by some friends of ours, Allison Renault and Flora Dutra, who are there right now in the Amazon watching this on their Starlink dish.
Oh, this is not at Amazon headquarters in Seattle. It's rather
This is
Amazon down
real
in Brazil.
Amazon. These are Amazon tribes.
Yeah. Okay.
The very first time ever.
So we actually have a worked example like this that we could draw some conclusions from. Somebody decided to put some laptops in the slums in India, and they provided no instructions, and the laptops were arranged so that they couldn't be stolen, and kids found them. And kids are not afraid to try anything. They don't know that they might break it, so they just try stuff. Eventually they learned how to use them, and became effective users of the laptops in India. So my guess is that it will be really fascinating to see how a culture which is relatively simple by comparison reacts to this sort of thing. Photographs, cameras were thought to steal the souls of the people whose pictures were taken. So who knows, what reactions they'll have. That'd be pretty interesting. If you'd never been in an elevator before, and you got into an elevator and the doors closed, and a little while later the doors open, and it's not the same place anymore, what would you think? So I hope somebody's going to document this.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to be live here.
Wow.
Live here for the first time. So that's coming up in just 40 minutes.
Holy moly. Okay, that's amazing. Well, let's wrap this one up so you can talk to some other people.
Let's do that.